One ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, and in the darkness to bind them.
This is the hour of the Shire folk, when they arise from their quiet fields to shake the towers and councils of the great.
Allow me a little autobiographical self-indulgence for a moment or two here to start off this episode, because we're going to delve into what was going on inside the mind of an 11 or 12-year-old Planet Evans. Pretty scary thought, huh? That was my age when I picked up The Hobbit and got my first taste of Tolkien. I remember enjoying reading it, especially any mention of elves. Because, you see, before I had read any of Tolkien's books, I had heard about his elves. From what I could gather from friends' descriptions, they were nothing like Santa's elves, or the Keebler elves, or that Lucky Charms leprechaun guy. They weren't the mischievous little fairies which sometimes granted wishes if you caught them, that I had read about as a much younger child and decided I didn't like very much. They had seemed pretty annoying and frivolous, like Tinkerbell. Something girls probably liked, but if you had any self-respect and sense, you went at them with a fly swatter. Tolkien's elves, however, were something entirely different, if what I had been told was true. They were magical, yes, but they were tall and noble and fair, but most importantly, they were powerful. More powerful in many, if not all respects, than men. Most of my D&D characters, therefore, needed to be elves. I hadn't read his stories yet when I started playing D&D, but I knew my adventurers needed all the elven advantages they could get. I enjoyed The Hobbit once I finally got around to reading it, like most D&D players eventually do, but if I'm being honest, it was a little disappointing. The supposedly superior elves didn't do very much at all in it, let alone anything impressive. And so then it was on to The Lord of the Rings, and just like Sam, I wanted to meet the elves as soon as possible. And I did, of course, as every reader does, but you still had to dig deep to find evidence or details of elven abilities. Elrond apparently could control the waters of the rivers in Rivendell, and that was pretty cool and interesting. But you had no idea this was the case at first because you see the scene at the Fort of Bruinen through the eyes of a rapidly fading Frodo, and you can't even tell if he is passing out and imagining things. After all, he sees white horses forming in the crests of the waves of the river water rushing towards the ringwraiths. Is he hallucinating or something? What the hell's going on? And if it's real, who or what the hell is causing it to happen? Only later, Gandalf explains to Frodo that he was in fact seeing things as they were really happening, and that Elrond caused the flood, and the horses were Gandalf's creative addition. Now, everybody knows how Gandalf can do such things, or so they think. He's a wizard, right? With a magical staff, and we all learned that simple stuff in The Hobbit. Also, if he can shape fireworks into dragons, like he did at Bilbo's farewell party, surely he can turn Whitewater into shapes of horses. But how did Elrond make the Bruinen recede only to release it as a tidal wave? Is this something all elves can do, or just great elven lords like him? You get no clear answers in the first book, The Fellowship of the Ring, only hints, such as Galadriel implying Elrond possesses one of the 3 elven rings, as Frodo clearly sees she does when they visit her mirror. Is that how he did it then, using his ring? Now, there were no Tolkien websites like the Encyclopedia of Arda when I was 12, so I could read on patiently and hope that I'd get answers, or check the index in The Return of the King for all the mentions of Elrond. And there it was in the final chapter of The Return of the King, a clear mention of Elrond possessing Vilya, the greatest of the 3 elven rings, and apparently it had a blue gem. Did that indicate water? Did his ring have power over water? Is that what let him control rivers in Rivendell? No more information, though, not even in the appendices. Wait a second. There were other Tolkien books at the bookstore that I completely ignored when I bought The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Next time I go to the bookstore, there's one on the shelf called The Complete Guide to Middle-earth. And it has definitions of like everything. What the hell is all this stuff? There's a ton of entries just for V alone. Vanyar, Varda, Vale of Arda. There it is, Vilya. What the hell? It's a ring of air? What about Galadriel's ring, Nenya? Let's see. Nazgul, Necromancer. Nenya, there it is. Hers is the ring of water? What the hell does that mean? How does Elrond control water with a ring of air? Let's see. Going through the introduction to this Tolkien dictionary, there are a lot of mentions of something called the Silmarillion. Is that where all these other names I don't recognize come from? Should I buy that too? It wasn't until I finished The Lord of the Rings and read the Silmarillion at age either 13 or 14, I think, that I got my real fix as far as what elves were capable of. Now, I suppose the Silmarillion doesn't do much for most fans of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. I think a lot of them pick it up and perhaps make it to page 50 or maybe even 100, until finally slamming it down and screaming, "Where are the fucking hobbits, asshole?" But for me, reading it was similar to the endorphin rush I got from hitting a home run in baseball, and I didn't have to get up off the couch to experience it, let alone risk getting plunked by my stupid friends who couldn't throw strikes to save their miserably uncoordinated skins. I was learning all the secrets behind the legends only hinted at in The Lord of the Rings. I was discovering the answers to all the questions, and I couldn't put it down. I even found out who or what Gandalf really was, and how he was related to Sauron in the supernatural lineages of Tolkien's world, and that apparently was called Arda. At last I knew why Gandalf didn't storm up to the gates of Barad-dûr and point his staff at the Dark Lord of Mordor, and believe you me, I spent a lot of mental energy while reading The Lord of the Rings on what would happen if Gandalf met Sauron in a one-on-one contest. For fuck's sake, I even learned that Sauron was once a disciple of the same Valar that Saruman studied under before being corrupted by and defecting to Morgoth. Talk about things clicking into place. The maker of the One Ring was a student of the very god that created all the mountains and valleys and likely forged armor and weapons for beings like Eowynwë, Manwë's herald and standard bearer. For the young teenage me, it felt like morphing into some higher being with perfect knowledge. No story had ever spoken to me quite like this before. My stack of Spider-Man comics seemed like lame Dr. Seuss kid stuff in comparison. But okay, I think that's enough of getting back in touch with the young teenage Planet Evans, and I promise I won't make you suffer through that again in this series. But I needed to take you through that because the point is, without being conscious of what was drawing me in, I was being hooked by the hierarchies of Tolkien's world. It all started with trying to figure out why elves could do things men couldn't, and ended up with my head spinning at how many levels of being and ability there were in his world. There were hierarchies within hierarchies within hierarchies. For example, look at the order of wizards that Gandalf and Saruman were part of, called the Istari, or the Istari. At the start of The Lord of the Rings, Saruman the White is their chief. Then next in line is Gandalf the Grey. And then perhaps the two blue wizards we never hear much about, whose names, LotR and Palindo, you can discover if you feel like digging through some pretty arcane reference material. And finally, probably at the bottom of this ranking, is Radagast the Brown, who gets goofed on for being a bird tamer. But what were these wizards really? Turns out they were a lesser type of angelic beings, collectively called the Ainur. The Ainur were made up of greater beings, the Valar, who were fewer in number than their many underlings or disciples called the Maiar. The 5 wizards, like Sauron, were Maiar chosen by the Valar to go to Middle-earth and assist in the battle against said Dark Lord. In Valinor, Saruman studied under the great smith of the Valar called Aule, Gandalf under the 3 Valar, who were the masters of spirits, Nienna, Irmo, and Mandos, referred to collectively as the Fëanturi. Radagast under Yavanna, sort of Tolkien's nature goddess. And LotR and Palindo likely were disciples of Orome, the huntsman of the Valar. Apropos of nothing, I sometimes think of Orome as one half of a bifurcated Tolkien god of war, the other half, of course, being Tulkas. The two of them most frequently engage directly with Melkor and his evil brood. And I have been reminded in the comments section of the first installment of this series that I should refer to Melkor by his well-earned alias Morgoth. so that's what I'll do from now on. Obviously, therefore, hierarchies also exist among the evil beings who have sworn allegiance to Morgoth. Sauron, presumably once again, is his most powerful servant. Under him are the Valur-Raukar, or Balrogs. Now it seems pretty clear they are a straight-up analog for Christian demons doing the bidding of Lucifer. But there are Balrogs and then there are Balrogs. Gothmog was Lord of Balrogs and Captain of Angband, and he had a personal guard of trolls, so you would assume he was the mightiest of all the Valur-Raukar. Again, hierarchies within hierarchies. Much like we find in Christianity. And much like you have Jehovah, or Yahweh if you prefer, in Christianity and the Abrahamic religions, you have Eru Iluvatar, sitting atop all the pyramids of power and superiority in Tolkien's monotheistic universe as the one true God and creator. And there are hierarchies as well among the non-angelic races, the children of Iluvatar. Men, the Hildor, the Etani, the Aftercomers, the younger of the children of Iluvatar, were weaker than the Quendi, the firstborn, the elves. Tolkien makes much ado of the frailty of men as compared to elves, mentioning it repeatedly. To illustrate, let's revisit one of my favorite scenes from the Silmarillion, and its connection to racial hierarchy may not be obvious at first, but I'll explain after we have a listen.
Now news came to Hithlum that Dorthonion was lost, and the sons of Finarfin overthrown, and that the sons of Feanor were driven from their lands. Then Fingolfin beheld, as it seemed to him, the utter ruin of the Noldor, and the defeat beyond redress of all their houses, and filled with wrath and despair, he mounted upon Rochalor, his great horse, and rode forth alone, and none might restrain him. He passed over Dor Newfauglith, like a wind amid the dust, and all that beheld his onset fled in amaze, thinking that Orome himself was come. For a great madness of rage was upon him, so that his eyes shone like the eyes of the Valar. Thus he came alone to Angband's gates, and he sounded his horn, and smote once more upon the brazen doors, and challenged Morgoth to come forth to single combat. And Morgoth came. That was the last time in those wars that he passed the doors of his stronghold, and it is said that he took not the challenge willingly. For though his might was greatest of all things in this world, alone of the Valar he knew fear. But he could not now deny the challenge before the face of his captains, for the rocks rang with the shrill music of Fingolfin's horn, and his voice came keen and clear down into the depths of Angband. And Fingolfin named Morgoth Craven and Lord of Slaves. Therefore Morgoth came, climbing slowly from his subterranean throne, and the rumour of his feet was like thunder underground. And he issued forth clad in black armour, and he stood before the king like a tower, iron-crowned, and his vast shield, sable, unblazoned, cast a shadow over him like a storm-cloud. But Fingolfin gleamed beneath it as a star, for his mail was overlaid with silver, and his blue shield was set with crystals, and he drew his sword, Ringil, that glittered like ice. Then Morgoth hurled aloft Grond, the hammer of the underworld, and swung it down like a bolt of thunder. But Fingolfin sprang aside, and Grond rent a mighty pit in the earth, whence smoke and fire darted. Many times Morgoth essayed to smite him, and each time Fingolfin leaped away, as a lightning shoots from under a dark cloud. And he wounded Morgoth with 7 wounds, and 7 times Morgoth gave a cry of anguish, whereat the hosts of Angband fell upon their faces in dismay, and the cries echoed in the Northlands. But at last the king grew weary, and Morgoth bore down his shield upon him. Thrice he was crushed to his knees, and thrice arose again, and bore up his broken shield and stricken helm. But the earth was all rent and pitted about him, and he stumbled and fell backward before the feet of Morgoth. And Morgoth set his left foot upon his neck, and the weight of it was like a fallen hill. Yet with his last and desperate stroke, Fingolfin hewed the foot with Ringil, and the blood gushed forth black and smoking, and filled the pits of Grond. Thus died Fingolfin, High King of the Noldor, most proud, and valiant of the elven kings of old.
Okay, I gotta admit that scene still gives me a few chills like it did when I was a kid. But why did I bring it up in reference to racial hierarchies in Arda? Well, think about it. How many beings in Arda could hope to wound the greatest of the Valar 7 times in single combat? The first few generations of Noldor, like Fingolfin, must have been something akin to demigods. And Fingolfin himself probably would have proven an equal or a tough fight even for a mighty Maya like Eowynwe, whose skills with weapons, we are told, surpassed that of all others in Arda. It's likely that not even Turin Turambar, arguably the mightiest and most valiant man to ever live, could do what Fingolfin did to Morgoth. And Fingolfin, though strong and valiant, was not even the greatest of the Noldor. That title belongs to Feanor. And remember, the Noldor are below the Vanyar in elven rankings. Ingwe, the king of the Vanyar, was High King of the Elves, not Finwë, the king of the Noldor, or his descendants who inherited his crown after Morgoth slew him. The point is, the greatest of all men, Turin, who is essentially the Feanor of men, cannot hope to achieve what an elf who is valiant but far from the greatest of his kind managed to accomplish. And much like elves could be ranked by kindred, Easterlings were no match for the Edain, like Turin. By now you already know what I'm going to say. Hierarchies within hierarchies within hierarchies. I will talk more about the battle between Fingolfin and Morgoth in the race and gender episode, because I believe it reveals something critical about which side Tolkien falls out on in the nature versus nurture debate. I think most progressives who despise the ideals they believe Tolkien espouses have a similar experience with his writing to the one I had as a kid, but in the exact opposite way. They don't all immediately recognize the prevalence of hierarchies as being at the core of their disdain, much like I wasn't conscious of the fact that they were pivotal to my enjoyment. And there are a million of these progressive critics out there who carry on about the inequalities in the Silmarillion and the Lord of the Rings while seeming to remain all but oblivious to the hierarchies. So rather than waste a lot of time attempting to read between the lines of a million or more criticisms to get at the true issue at hand, let me highlight one that gets right to the hierarchical point. One quick digression before I get into this article. Many critics and enthusiasts alike tend to label Tolkien a romantic, and that's not in the sense of someone who enjoys reading Romeo and Juliet and bringing roses and boxes of chocolate to love interests. That's in the sense of romanticism with a capital R, the philosophical and artistic movement of the 18th and 19th centuries that was a reaction to the Industrial Revolution and modernity. Now, just as I did not wish to delve into a lengthy analysis of progressivism, let's just quickly define romanticism as a glorification of nature and the past and a revival of medievalism. And let's accept that the label does indeed apply to Tolkien, though arguments can be made that it does so rather imperfectly. And yes, for those of you who have read Isaac Asimov's Foundation series, the author of this article, David Brin, is indeed the science fiction writer David Brin who wrote an addition to that universe. Brin here is talking about the conflict between the Romantics and modernity. In this conflict, J.R.R. Tolkien stood firmly for the past. Calling the scientific worldview soulless, he joined Keats and Shelley, Sir Walter Scott, Henry James, and many European-trained philosophers in spurning the modern emphasis on pragmatic experimentation, production, universal literacy, progress, cooperative enterprise, democracy, city life, and flattened social orders. There's a very important phrase right there. In contrast to these sterile pursuits, Romantics extolled the traditional, the personal, the particular, the subjective, the rural, the hierarchical, and the metaphorical. This fits the very plot of The Lord of the Rings, in which the good guys strive to preserve and restore as much as they can of an older, graceful, and natural hierarchy against the disturbing, quasi-industrial, and vaguely technological ambiance of Mordor, with its smokestack imagery and manufactured power rings that can be used by anybody, not just an elite few. Romanticism never made any pretense at equality. It is hyper-discriminatory by nature. Whole classes of people are less worthy, less deserving of life than other classes. The Nazis were archetypal romantics. I guess since Romanticism is a throwback to medieval times, the V-2 rocket barrage the Nazis unleashed on Britain was an homage to missiles and projectiles launched out of ballistas and catapults, you know. Anyway, you may find this hard to believe, but I had no idea this Brin article existed before starting this little project. And here he is pretty much stealing my thunder for not just this video, but the entire series. He realizes hierarchies are preferred, and equality is ignored as an utter absurdity hardly worth consideration in Tolkien's fiction, and he fully comprehends the conflict between the professor's ideals and progressivism. Now, Bryn does get a little tongue-in-cheek toward the end of the piece, when he toys with the idea of Sauron and Mordor representing and advocating for modern progress. But make no mistake, he is quite serious throughout that Tolkien and his allegedly romantic convictions are, as the saying goes, on the wrong side of history. There's also a moment when Bryn states something akin to the point I will address here shortly, that Tolkien does indeed cross-examine his hierarchies. But for Bryn, this self-doubt is nothing more than an afterthought. It's a bug in Tolkien's writing, not a feature. Something that Tolkien scrambles to offer his critics, in Bryn's mind, only after they seem to have him cornered, like the damn title of the article claims, as an enemy of progress. I will talk more about Tolkien's view of progress in Part 4, Good versus Evil. You can be guaranteed it is much more nuanced than critics, even the seemingly charitable ones like Bryn, care to admit. If you do take the time to read the article, and I encourage you to do so, if for no other reason than to hear an opinion other than mine, you may get the sense that Bryn is being quite fair and patient with a quaint-minded traditionalist like Tolkien, and that I am, in fact, the one missing the point of Bryn's critique, which, when you come down to it, is just a sincere defense of modern technological advancement in the face of an onslaught from a popular franchise and its largely thoughtless fan base. He just wants those unthinking normies that I myself have already complained about to use their heads a bit more instead of simply cheering on the Rohirrim, right? Well, if that's the case, then why does he close the article with an appeal for readers to forget everything Tolkien just laid out for them the second they close the books? Why does he want them to immediately discard what they spent 1,000 pages absorbing? Fact of the matter is, this is standard fork-tongued progressive deception, and I don't think I'm overstating it by phrasing it that way. This is what they always do. They tell you to think until you see things their way, and then they tell you to stop thinking. And this is Bryn's most unforgivable crime, right up there with bringing up the Nazis for no good reason. However, Bryn's theatrical confirmation of Godwin's law and his reluctance to give Tolkien true and meaningful credit, notwithstanding, he is of course right about hierarchies being the rule in Tolkien's universe, and the progressive notion of equality being about as absent in his writing as a kind and generous orc. But why? Why is this the case, and what does it tell us about Tolkien? By now, you're probably sick of me saying it. Tolkien had an affinity for hierarchies. Frodo is not Gandalf's equal. Gandalf could squash him, and in turn, if Sauron gets the ring back, Gandalf, even Gandalf the White, would likely be a flea to him. Witness how Saruman the White became the Dark Lord of Mordor's thrall and lackey without the need of the One Ring. There is no equality other than in matters of common decency and treatment of others. Notice how respectful, if at times impatient, Gandalf is with frivolous hobbits. Hierarchy is the most critical part of Tolkien's personal philosophy, and whatever religious leanings or morals it can be argued he consciously injected into the stories. Fans of Tolkien will know that the professor often butted heads with C.S. Lewis over stylistic differences. Tolkien was not a fan of Lewis's overt Christian symbolism. Something that goes largely unnoticed by most Tolkien readers is that there are essentially no religious structures or ceremonies of any kind to be found in Middle-earth. There's hardly any prayer even, except at times of great need and danger, such as when Sam confronts Shelob with the Starglass and chants to Elbereth. This lack of religious trappings is pretty exceptional for an author who is quite devoted to his faith in real life, and whose works are usually interpreted as strong Christian metaphor. I may say this phrase quite often in this series, but there are no coincidences, and especially not with Tolkien, who pored over every last line of his prose. For him, and for all skilled artists, less is more. The hierarchical structure in the genealogy of his supernatural beings is about as evident as Tolkien's deference to his real-world devotion ever gets. So when you finally find a hint of something in his writing, such as when Gandalf becomes Gandalf the White, and we learn that powers greater than him not only exist, but intervene in world affairs, be sure that he meant you to take it seriously. Hierarchies are no laughing matter for Tolkien. They are essentially the only hints a reader will ever get of his high esteem for Christianity. To wit, Gandalf rides around on Shadowfax combating the fell creatures of Sauron and Saruman, and giving guidance to hobbits and Rohirrim and the warriors of Gondor, much like Orome did ages before in Beleriand and the far east of Middle-earth. when he was hunting the dread beasts of Morgoth in order to lead the elves from darkness to light. Now personally, I don't recall any angelic beings in the Bible doing likewise, and yet Tolkien has 2 of his mythical figures acting this way. The only tales with reminiscent imagery that I can think of are Nordic myths, where Odin, on his 8-legged steed Sleipnir, galloped about acting as shaman or guru for mortal worshippers. So even his subdued tribute to Christian hierarchies has this Manichaean or mixed religiosity to it. The whiffs of Christianity are faint, but they are there. Again, less is more. Those at the upper levels of Tolkien's hierarchies are forever correcting the foolish mistakes of those on the lower rungs. This is the Christian notion of rescuing the weak and the needy, and delivering them from the hands of the wicked. And of course, the Christian notion of forgiveness. Recall Tom Bombadil saving the hobbits from the White after they got lost on the Barrow Downs, and Aragorn repairing the fallout from their poor decision-making in Bree and the Prancing Pony, and Gandalf having to sacrifice himself in Moria because Pippin couldn't resist the temptation of a deep well and ended up awaking Dorinsbane, and so on. This is what the strong and wise do in Tolkien's version of a moral world. They protect the weak, often from their own stupidity, and they are eventually rewarded for this altruism and retain status above those lower in the hierarchy. Gandalf, after he completes his mission in Middle-earth, will be allowed back into Valinor, as will Elrond and Galadriel. Mere mortals like Merry and Pippin and Fatty Bolger will not. Exceptions are made for the ring-bearers, of course, Bilbo, Frodo, and Sam. This state of affairs is not to spite the weak or those with lesser roles. On the contrary, it is to ensure that they can be saved from future mishaps. Tolkien understands if no reward is forthcoming, the positive behavior of leaders won't last forever and eventually will be replaced by apathy or something worse. Even the most Christian individuals have their limits, and it is only fair to reward them accordingly to avoid testing those limits. This is also why Aragorn gets to be king, and Faramir and Éowyn are given a principality to rule over in Ithilien after the War of the Ring. The Rangers of the North, who secretly and selflessly protected the Shire and Bree for all those years, were likely rewarded similarly with lands and positions of authority when Aragorn restored the northern capital of Annúminas in Arnor. So the progressives are in fact right when they say that inequality is the rule in Tolkien's universe, but they are wrong for suggesting that this automatically translates into persecution and bigotry. After all, if Tolkien supported abusing one's power and position in life, then the Rangers would have subjugated the hobbits instead of guarding the borders of the Shire. And Faramir would have killed Frodo and Sam in Henneth Annûn and seized the ring. But he even spares the life of a lowly and miserable creature like Gollum, who couldn't be any farther down in the social hierarchy. And Faramir breaks the law of his land in doing so. However, as we will see shortly here, Tolkien also understands all too well that hierarchies are no guarantee of idyllic Christian outcomes. There are innumerable instances in the Silmarillion and the Lord of the Rings where hierarchies are challenged and interrogated, and sometimes where they go completely haywire. Look at what happens when the Valar try to push their will onto men.
But now the whisper went among the elves that Manwë held them captive, so that men might come and supplant them in the kingdoms of Middle-earth. For the Valar saw that they might more easily sway this short-lived and weaker race, defrauding the elves of the inheritance of Ilúvatar. Small truth was there in this, and little have the Valar ever prevailed to sway the wills of men. But many of the Noldor believed, or half-believed, the evil words.
When the gods try to pull rank on men, there is a giant fizzle. One could argue it didn't go much better with elves. One of the most classic cases of hierarchies gone wrong is the story of the Oath of Fëanor, and more broadly the interplay between the Valar and the Noldor. Now, obviously, Morgoth had a hand in the mayhem, as he did in almost all the chaos of the Elder Days. But what is Fëanor doing by enacting his oath to retake the Silmarils and getting as many Noldor as possible to swear their allegiance to his goal? He is rebuking the dominion the Valar have over him and the elves, and he is at the same time wielding his own status and power to solidify another hierarchy, with him firmly at the top as the High King of the Noldor. And just as he challenges the Valar, many Noldor under him challenge his oath and the hierarchy he wishes to reinstate and enforce, while at the same time they're dreaming of starting their own realms and rule in Middle-earth. And although the Oath of Feanor resulted in great tragedy, it also produced heroes, legends, and great beauty. Listen to how Chapter 9 of the Silmarillion, entitled Of Beren and Luthien, begins.
Among the tales of sorrow and of ruin that come down to us from the darkness of those days, there are yet some in which amid weeping there is joy, and under the shadow of death light that endures. And of these histories most fair still in the ears of the elves is the tale of Beren and Luthien.
So even as Tolkien warns you of the perils of going against the hierarchical grain, he also tells you that if you do, there will be some pretty incredible lore that comes out of it. The caveat is, of course, that your reasons for doing so must be sound. More on this later on. And as if to put a final period on the story of the Oath of Feanor, one of his gems, finally retaken from Morgoth, after ages of strife and battle, will forever adorn the evening sky in the west with its brilliance. But of course that isn't really the end of Feanor's story, is it? His influence and legacy span ages. How far do I need to delve into the tale of Numenor and its downfall to uncover the cautionary tale of hierarchy to be found within it? Idril Celebrimbor, a Noldor princess who would not have been in Middle-earth but for the Oath of Feanor, begat with Tuor a long-lived line of men with elven blood in their veins. These men established a glorious island empire, the Atlantis of Tolkien's world, so to speak. Now, Jordan Peterson and his fans should find the tale of Numenor quite fascinating and edifying, because it details all the good that can come from societal strata, while clearly demonstrating that they require vigilant monitoring, lest they go awry and/or lead to abuse. The faithful of Numenor should be the ultimate heroes for Peterson and his followers, as they are the ones who not only recognize the need to keep watch on the king, but follow through and maintain the long vigil, preparing for the worst. Even the existence of the One Ring can in large part be attributed to Feanor's pride and rash decisions ages before it was created. After all, Celebrimbor, the chief elven smith responsible for the elven rings of power, is a direct descendant, Feanor's grandson in fact, and the other elven smiths were Noldor as well, who, like Idril, would never have been in Middle-earth but for the Oath of Feanor. And the rings of power are themselves acknowledgement that hierarchies can go terribly wrong, and must always be watched and scrutinized. What else were the Witch King of Angmar and the other black Numenorians who accepted one of the 9 rings for mortal men hoping to achieve, besides hacking the normal power structures humans tend to form? They were seeking unnatural hierarchical advantages, and such rewards come at a steep price, which for them was nothing short of their souls. Once again, David Brin and I agree on some basic impressions or interpretations, but not on the takeaway message. Let me read another passage from his article. But I think there's more to ringwraiths. To me, they distill the classical Greek notion of hubris, a concept that romantics often embrace, the idea that pain and damnation await any mortal whose ambition aims too high. Don't try putting on the trappings or the emblems or powers that rightfully belong to your betters. Above all, don't try to decipher and redistribute mysteries. I guess it's Brin's opinion that the 9 were simply engaging in scientific discovery and advancement when they accepted and wielded Sauron's gifts. Celebrimbor and the Elven Smiths who made the rings had to learn this lesson the hard way as well. It was not until Sauron revealed himself in the One Ring to them that the potential folly and exploitable nature of their creations became clear. They wished to amplify and enhance the good that can come from rulers and nobility, and it backfired. Hierarchies are no guarantee of beneficial outcomes. They can be twisted and perverted and therefore must be policed. And sometimes it's a case that hierarchies are simply incompatible with other hierarchies. When Aragorn takes the throne, it signals the dawn of the Age of Men. So even racially superior elves have to, well, they have to go back to Valinor. In light of all the carrying on regarding hierarchies I've been up to in this episode, what I'm about to say may seem a little strange. Hipsters are a lot like our real-world hobbits. Frivolous and incredibly annoying 99% of the time, but ultimately harmless, provided they don't take themselves and their childish notions of how the world should work too seriously. Hipsters are the politically innocuous version of their more pernicious cousins, the social justice warrior and Antifa types, who are of course the Grima Wormtongues, Sackville Bagginses, and Bill Ferneys of our own universe. People who have decided they are equal or superior to their betters without having done a single thing to earn such status. and who, more importantly, promote open borders policy through violence if they deem it necessary, in order to allow the other into our civilization. They believe they are tearing down a system which gives privileges to the native few. They don't see citizenship and status as things you may have earned by doing your part to enhance and preserve your society. Whatever rights and comfort you enjoy are the result of an exclusionary system wrongfully preventing the rest of the world from becoming your equal. In other words, progressives believe any stratification within a society is irredeemable and must be eliminated. Recall how David Brin phrased the progressive preference: flattened social orders, and such steamrolled structure is to be forced on everyone, even if no one at the bottom is complaining and those at the top are clearly endeavoring to keep the rank and reward system pointed in the right direction. Whereas it is Tolkien's view that a hierarchy aimed the wrong way is as bad, if not worse, than no hierarchy at all. And what is the right direction? The right direction is for the preservation of the civilization that created the hierarchy in the first place, and the safeguarding of what citizens within that society have established over countless generations, and therefore what they agree works best for them. This should be axiomatic and require little defense or explanation, especially after a clear-headed reading of The Scouring of the Shire. As with hobbits and brief folk, it unfortunately does not take much for hipsters to cross the line and transition into someone who, rather than climb the hierarchy the right way, decides to subvert it and gain status by helping the other, the outsider who has little interest in the preservation of a civilization as is, because in its present form it does not benefit him. The transitioned hipster will do this under the pretense of equality, without much thought as to what kind of hierarchy the outsider might work to establish. As a consequence, many would argue that the best way to deal with the hipster hobbit is to make sure he stays in his lane and sticks to his trifling lifestyle, because should some course correction in life be sought, 9 times out of 10 it will lead to the destructive Antifa-type metamorphosis. That's just how things with these people tend to turn out, especially given that they normally seek to better themselves through an educational system, which at this point in human history is clearly dominated by radical progressives. But nothing in Tolkien's writing, as far as I can tell, suggests, let alone urges, that we keep those low on the totem pole in their place. Even frivolous leftists. Nothing about your position in a properly formed and functioning hierarchy is or should be written in stone, other than you can't willfully pervert its purpose. You can't be Lotho or Sandyman and try to rise above your station in life by giving the hateful other a chance to conquer your civilization from within. You can, however, be Frodo, Sam, Merry, or Pippin, and assist those with your culture's best interests in mind. Your glaring inequality relative to the Gandalfs and Aragorns of the world be damned. The opportunity to level up should be available to you. According to Tolkien, you don't have to stay in your lane, but if you do decide to pass, you better be pointed in the right direction, or someone higher up on the hierarchy, or people at the same level as you, but who are pointed in the right direction, will rightfully run you down. Alright everybody, that's it for this episode and all the points I think I need to raise to further the purpose of this series. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next upload, Part 3, Race and Gender.